Hello, class. Today we will be going over Chapter 14, Asian Americans. This is also a very important segment because typically Asian Americans don't get as much, I suppose, coverage in U.S. history as others. But hopefully we're going to change that a little bit and open up the discussion, especially with some of the more modern examples we have of the sort of L.A. 1990s riots with the Korean Americans. Obviously, we'll go over the Japanese Americans with some internment camp issues and recent, let's say, new representations in film. I thought many of you would actually like my implementation of more movies and film-related representation. So hopefully that goes on well. But let us kind of start with where the book ends up introducing us to the topic, which is a hunting party. The book introduces us to Mr. Chai Vang, and so he was a Hmong immigrant from Laos, and inevitably he found himself going off with a couple of friends, and their sons to sort of a hunting party, right? And they were going to go hunting with the rifles and such. Now, there was pretty much nothing going on out of the ordinary, and then suddenly they had a very tense situation where they encountered some whites, I suppose. From what this story goes, they wandered onto the property of Terry Williers, and he was ordering them off. And supposedly, Vang was refusing, and then walked away into the forest. Now, from what the court was trying to delineate between all parties involved and who said what, more words were spoken. They got very heated. Shots were fired. 6 people were dead and 2 wounded. Obviously, this turned into a criminal investigation and started going to jury. So Vang was arguing that a bunch of racial epithets were spoken against him and that he was acting in self-defense. The white party, I suppose, was arguing that Vang was not an innocent bystander. He specifically chased and hunted them down to kill them. And eventually, whenever they went to trial, the jury ended up agreeing. They ended up convicting him on 6 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of second-degree murder. Sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms in prison, plus 70 years. As if the 6th was not enough, they tacked on the extra 70 years. This controversial sort of event was known as the Hmong shooting. Now, this is an interesting analysis on in a number of ways. First, the fact that we had these 2 different opinions. Obviously, one side is going to say I didn't do it. The other side is going to say yes, he did it. But the interesting part is whenever the racial epithets were being thrown at each other, the way that Vang reacted. And let's say, for the sake of argument, and I mean this is as the jury decided, right? And so I'll go off of the jury's decision. So let's say Vang, after being, spoken to just derogatorily, right? Whether they called him narrow eyes, Asian, yellow, whatever the derogatory terms they were going to use against him, he essentially just snapped and started hunting them down like dogs. And so this is an excellent example of, do not throw racial epithets at people because you never know how they are going to react, when they hear such things, right? Obviously, the attack is meant to be personal and people can take it very personally. So just don't do it as a rule of thumb. Second, this also, speaks to the community because I know from my research, it is not typically a very good look for the Asian American community or the Hmong community or anything else when you have these type of headlines. Very similarly to any type of other community in, let's say, Los Angeles, where if you are of Asian descent or Latin American descent or African American descent, whatever, if any news comes out of you or your people or your community, you typically want it to be positive, right? A nice PR spin. You don't want negative news affecting you. So, for instance, half of my community in Los Angeles is Armenian, right? And so if I were to see things in the news, I want to see things such as Let's say we donated money to various community centers. Oh, this person cured cancer, and then we raised more funds for schools and built buildings or whatever, right? Nice positive things. I do not want to see oh, there's a shootout in Glendale, or there was fraud and millions of dollars stolen from government assistance, whatever, right? You always want a nice positive spin on things. And so this kind of denotes, this kind of goes against the sort of typical community guidelines that were to be, let's say, adhered to, right, for Asian Americans. These are a couple of the photos from the actual trial with testification on the specific rifle, how it was handled, all of the words that were said, and the particular individual on the right-hand side being sentenced to all of his consecutive life sentences, right? And obviously tearing up at that prospect. But I can imagine it being very bittersweet because, well, not even bittersweet, but just bitter. Because, obviously when you have all those racial epithets thrown against you, you are going to feel a certain type of way. And I can't remember exactly where I heard this phrase, but all of us are just, a couple of really bad days away from potentially snapping, right? So, who knows what was going on in this guy's life at the time, right? I haven't gone into further research into what was going on in his life at the time, but let's say work wasn't going well, maybe his marriage was falling apart or whatever. And then boom, this was just the final nail in the coffin. No pun intended. And so he just snapped. So whenever, racial epithets are involved, don't do it. But the cultural analysis here is that, many folks among the Hmong community believe that controversy should be averted at all costs, right? And that is a very sort of, I suppose, Eastern mentality, right? Whether we're talking about Asian Americans or just Asian culture in general. I know we have very similar ones in Russian and Armenian communities as well. Do not, you are a representative of your community, right? Not just your family, but your community as well. So always act with, very good intentions, always act honorably. And so you do not want negative press or controversy to surround you or your people or your community. And so here, the idea is, right, the sort of train of thought is, if you bring negative attention to yourself or your community, that is going to lead to confrontation with others. And that inevitably is going to lead toward discrimination. So the idea, I suppose, is keep your head low, work hard, don't ruffle too many feathers with negative headlines, and the community will uplift itself, and you will be incorporated into the American system. Now, this kind of goes through some historical markers as well, because during the French War in Indochina, during the American War in Vietnam, I suppose the historical past imprinted itself onto their cultural present, because in whether we're talking about Laos or Cambodia or Vietnam, all of these different communities, all these different types of peoples, they were affected by war. They were affected by immense hardship, and so avoiding attention and sort of choosing more isolation was kind of a safety net for the community, right? In actuality, and so it was kind of that situation where if you don't say anything, no one is going to be looking at you in the crowd, right? And so very similarly in my class, let's say if we're going to go back to in-person class one of these days, if it is an auditorium of 200 and I ask a question, everyone kind of starts, putting their head down a little bit because they don't want to be called on, right? And so very kind of, I suppose, similar tactic here. And so Vang himself was actually, fleeing Asia in the 80s to get away from the various ramifications of the Vietnam War, and then, settled in California, then Minnesota. And so he was a sort of a product of this community. And so the fact that he acted in such a unfortunately, an aggressive way with all of those killings, that was not what the community wanted at all. And this was, this was right after the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was implemented, which was eliminating national origins quotas. Because previous to that, the U.S. started to put quotas for a couple of decades on various parts of the world, right? Quotas based on the region of the world and how many of different types of people we wanted. It was obviously skewed to a certain extent, because the numbers of Europeans was usually more than the numbers of Africans or Asians that they wanted to come into the States. Same goes for Latin Americans as well. And so over time, immigration has changed a little bit with the various laws we have. But as we all know today, turn on the news, it's always still a contentious issue. That is for darn sure. The Chinese Americans. The Chinese Americans in Los Angeles in particular have had a wonderful history, and in California as well, just overall. The reason being, once early Chinese immigrants came to the States and to the shores, they found wonderful amounts of work working for the railroad companies and working very hard for the mining companies as well. They were, in the 1800s, as I say in my actual U.S. courses, they were just as American as anyone else, because if you were the backbone of the railroad industry in the 1800s, you are American, right? That is quintessential U.S. history, Western expansion, cowboys and Indians type of history, right? You built the railroads, for God's sake. And so, many of them being here from the 1850s, or towards the late 1800s, they started to form various communities and various organizations and districts. One of the famous ones being the Six Companies. And this is a wonderful example of, as soon as your community starts to grow in the home country, such as here in the United States or California or such, you and your community are going to start providing these services for new folks coming in, whether that be employment, loans, helping them with businesses, or sending the kids to the right schools, right? And so you are helping your own kind whenever you're coming over here to the States, right? Teaching them the ropes, so to speak. And so because of the sort of culturally traditional strong family ties, strong family kinships, respecting of elders, right? Very kind of Eastern marks of culture that they had and still have. They were sort of banding together, right? And so, you can trust your family members, you can trust your extended family members a lot better than strangers in the United States. And so they were perhaps not safe to say completely distrustful of the host society, but to a certain extent they were, cautious, I would definitely say. And so, they were, of course, especially cautious, especially after the Chinese Exclusion Act, because that Chinese Exclusion Act was, the only one in U.S. history where a particular group of individuals based off of their ethnicity, right, the Chinese, all of them, were excluded from the United States from immigration. No other time in U.S. history has that ever happened. We have never had the French Exclusion Act, the Brazilian Exclusion Act, or the Australian Exclusion Act. It has always been the one era in U.S. history where they actually excluded an entire peoples. And this was happening because the west coast of the United States was getting an overwhelming amount of Chinese immigration. I go into far more detail about this, why that happened in my U.S. courses, because at the time China was going through very tumultuous experiences with famine, population control issues, and especially with colonialism with European countries. And so being in various parts of China at that moment in time was not the best life. And so people were looking to get out. And at that point in time, late 1800s, the United States was a beacon for opportunity and expansion, right? You can come here, work hard, make some good money, and kind of go on your merry way. But yeah, of course, over time, things were eventually changing between the U.S. and China. Unfortunately, for the two, as soon as Mao Zedong ended up having this communist revolution in the early 1900s, that created a permanent sort of shift between China and the United States. Also, specifically creating a permanent Chinese American community. Because if you could imagine, before the communistic revolution in China, the steady flow of immigration from China to the U.S. was still occurring. And then once they became heavily communistic and the United States just axed sort of the interaction with the country for ideological reasons, for Cold War reasons, etc. Whoever was in the United States at that time of Chinese descent or heritage, they now firmly, instead of being Chinese, they are now Chinese American, right? And their kids and grandkids are now Chinese American. So that created an entire different sort of identity group. And this is a very interesting video that I found. So they go through, I believe it was in Beijing, right? But, China proper, right? So they're walking through China proper and asking Chinese people today, what do you think of Chinese Americans, right? And so it is a very interesting look towards it, right? Because they are essentially, I suppose, a Chinese American would be like the diaspora for the official Chinese, right? Or for the full-bred Chinese, however you want to categorize that as. And so they're asking them like, hey, do you think they are actually Chinese? Do you understand them? How are their accents? How are their cultural mannerisms? Would you ever marry one? All of these just modern questions that's pretty interesting to ask and to get responses for. And so this kind of, goes and dips into this analysis of transnational identity. Transnational meaning it goes beyond the borders of various countries, right? Your people can be spread throughout numerous regions and territories of the world, essentially going beyond the national border or transnational. And so it's interesting to see how proper or homegrown right now Chinese or living in China, right, how they view Chinese Americans. And maybe some of you feel the same way. Let's say if you are of Mexican descent, right, and you are a fully, fledged Mexican American, speak English, Spanish, all combined together, etc. If you go back to, let's say, Mexico for to see family or family trip or whatever, do the people immediately recognize whenever you speak Spanish that you have a slight accent, right? Or something is different, or you have a cultural mannerism and something is not quite right. Or whether you are Middle Eastern and you have very similar situations, right? You go back to the home country and they immediately just pick it up. They're like, oh, you're sort of one of us, but you're not really one of us, right? And so it's very interesting to kind of see these dynamics. I have that same experience myself. I can speak Russian, but it's not like homegrown Russian with people actually going to professional school in Russia, right? I kind of learned just through my family here in Los Angeles. And so, if I ever were to go back to Russia, as soon as I step inside that cab and I say "Privyet" or whatever, they're going to be like, you're a tourist, where are you from? They're immediately going to understand and probably charge me like triple the price for a cab ride. But that's another story entirely. But yeah, definitely watch this video. It is pretty interesting to see some of the responses. Moving forward with the Chinese American community throughout the decades, now that sort of China and the U.S. have been sort of politically severed, the Chinese Americans found themselves in a situation where they had to, support themselves and really kind of band together, right? Because, anything from the home country was severed off. And so by the 1970s, the Chinese American community was actually doing a pretty darn successful job of achieving that middle class status, middle class life. Attributed primarily, I believe so, because of old school Eastern values. And if any of you are from Asian descendant countries, you can attest to this. That typical stereotype of, the Asian parents are wanting the best for you and kind of just, working you to the bone almost. Because various cultural aspects, hard work, entrepreneurial skills, education being very important to them. These type of attributes, help the community to grow and uplift themselves, right? My family had very similar cultural attributes when we came here to the States with very, very little money. And within essentially, a decade, a couple of decades or so, by the time I was a child to now, our family has been able to get back on our feet. And so my family even can attest to some of these skills. They do work when put to the test. But Chinese Americans throughout the years were shown in various images of TV programs, films, etc. Sometimes, of course, having unfair representation and slight elements of racism, whether we're talking about the Hawaii Five-0, some Mission Impossible films, The Good Earth, World of Susie Wong. A lot of these representations in film are very important. And throughout this lecture, I am going to be citing a lot of sort of media and film-related representation because, in my opinion, throughout the 1900s, Hollywood and filmmaking has had an enormous impact, not just on the United States, but the world. That has been pretty much one of the largest exporters of American culture and values and what the American society and public actually think of various individuals, right? And it feeds into a lot of the subconscious bias that we have. And so hopefully you like that sort of frame of reference that I'm going to be using for this lecture. But a lot of these kids, these young kids, were acculturated to American life over time. They were becoming real Americanized kids, right? They were speaking English, going to school, behaving properly to whatever extent you want to argue that, celebrating American holidays, joining Boy and Girl Scouts, etc., right? The acculturation process was truly going underway. So potentially, let's say, and there's many examples of this even today, but let's say you have a Chinese American living in San Francisco today. And the family can go back, let's say, a couple of generations to their grandparents / great-grandparents whenever they came to the United States originally. Their parents and grandparents might be a little bit more old school and speak a little bit more Chinese and have a few of the traditions a little bit. And then the kid today, right, the youngster, the millennial, is going to be basically all American, right? Maybe they forgot how to speak Chinese. They never bothered to learn. And the parents kind of just gave up on that. Maybe they have just fully American traditions. They don't want to do Chinese New Year anymore. They want to do actual just New Year with their friends, not have as much Asian-inspired, Chinese-inspired culture aspects there. Sometimes that acculturation does happen a little more aggressively than others. Sometimes you do still have that nice sort of mix and balance of the two, where the family still says, hey, we want you to learn Chinese. We want you to still know your heritage and know your culture, but of course be very proficient in English at the same time. Really just depends on a family-to-family basis. But in Los Angeles, at least, we have the famous Chinatown. And if you visit Los Angeles, or if you live in Los Angeles, you should definitely visit Chinatown, because it is a sight to behold. Many shops, many owned family businesses, and a lot of cool products that you're not going to get on the regular markets, right? And so you can definitely go in, explore, but this has its roots from the original Chinatown that was built in Los Angeles, and over the decades and over the years has slowly just evolved and slowly kind of grew into what it is now. Let's talk about Japanese Americans. We talked about this a little bit, last time with the sort of Japanese internment camps with World War II. But this is kind of trying to discuss Japanese Americans post-World War II, right? What kind of life, I suppose, they had in the United States, more or less, after that period of time. And so, after, many number of years, the Issei had confronted a alien culture, right? As Japan was on the rise, the Japanese Empire is a Pacific power. We talked about this earlier. Nativist fears increased, leading to internment camps. Now, in 1948, the Japanese Evacuation Claims Act did award them $38 million. They initially wanted $400 million, but they got 38. Eventually, through much legal action, and this is an example to any of you in the future who want to enact justice and societal change in the world. Legality and going through the courts is a very, very good way of doing things. And so eventually the government did overall compensate them $1 billion, right, for all of the troubles and all the sorries that they had to go through. Whether throwing money at this situation is actually going to help alleviate some of the social, mental trauma that was impacted onto these families is another matter entirely, but at least, some compensation is better than nothing. And so if we're moving into the 50s, right, 50s, 60s eventually, we started getting many of these GIs coming back from World War II. People were, especially after Japan surrendered and the United States essentially became the protector of Japan and kind of incorporated it into their sphere of influence, building bases in Japan, even today. The U.S. military and Japan are very close, right? And many military members who are stationed in that part of the world, they go to Japan, they visit, and there's, members there. A lot of the GIs were coming back, and they were impressed with Japan's, lifestyle, their culture, their stability, their wives, right? They were bringing back many Japanese wives, and sort of a lot of intermarriage was occurring during this time as well. They were marveling at their sort of discipline, their economic skill, right? They were, just engrossed in this Japanese culture that for so long they thought they were the enemy because we were at war. But then as soon as war simmered down, they ended up noticing that a lot of those values were actually very, sought after. And then, a nice little kind of segue would be the 52 McCarran-Walter Act. So this act in particular governed immigration and citizenship to the U.S., upholding some of those national origin quotas. Now, the U.S. has always had these tumultuous experiences with nationalities, quotas, immigration issues. This is such a deep immigration history here, right? And I'm only kind of scratching the surface occasionally. But in '56, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that California's alien land laws violated the 14th Amendment, and it led to a huge boom in Japanese immigration from 45 to 2000. Having approximately 200 plus thousand Japanese coming over to the U.S. through immigration. And so, because of activism in the court systems, they were able to sort of get rid of some of that discrimination, right, in the legislative body process, which is, once again, how things should be. However, many of the Japanese Americans, as this video goes into a little more detail, they were also describing some of their experiences living in America after World War II, whether it was having slight discrimination or whether it was having successful communities build up. And then by the time they have kids, let's say in the 70s and 80s, they were talking about in the video, some of the kids in the 70s and 80s, they had it made. Nobody was really bothering them. Nobody was looking at them. Their families were already rising up in the socioeconomic status because they were just working hard and their businesses were successful, etc. Some of the kids were now having typical, I suppose, non-immigrant experiences or homegrown experiences where you are too bored for your own good. And so these kids were getting into like drugs, gangs, dropping out of school sometimes. And so they started to have some of those issues, right, as well. But a fascinating short video to watch if you're interested. And of course, many of the folks who were the families that were affected by the internment camps through the Japanese American community, because that was the one, I would say huge, big marker in the 1900s for them. Various memorials put up, right? That huge compensation fund of $1 billion passed for them. And, since then, thankfully, the Japanese American community has never really had this large event happen to them, right? Or anything close. They've pretty much just, skimmed under the radar. You never pretty much hear of anything on the news, right? I never click on the news and hear the Japanese American community in Los Angeles, X, Y, and Z is happening to them, right? Everything's pretty silent and quiet, which means that if everything is silent and quiet, that means things are going great. When you don't hear of things, it means that everything is chugging along as it should be. Let's kind of segue a little bit into Filipino Americans. Filipino Americans are oftentimes, if Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson were here, he would probably agree with my quote, right? The hardest workers in the room. If anyone has a Rock sort of Under Armour t-shirts, you know what I'm talking about. But Filipino Americans have had a long sort of tumultuous history with immigration as well. But over time, and especially through legal intervention, whether it was thrown throughout their own community or joining with, like, let's say Cesar Chavez with the AWOC, uniting with the United Farm Workers, they successfully were fighting for their rights and fighting for equal treatment under the law. Going all the way back to, let's say, the 60s with Lyndon B. Johnson, and trying to abolish national origins formulas. Or going towards, like I said, their interactions with Chavez and the sort of farm workers organizations. They were successfully winning time after time. Now, since the 70s and 80s, the Philippines has seen actually a big increase in migration because, number one, a lot of them, this is not widely known, but the U.S. was in control of the Philippines for a short while. And so there is that sort of American English influence there. Not largely, because a lot of it is still Spanish influence, because many of them still speak Spanish and have actually this sort of weird, tumultuous history with like European white standards, right, still in the Philippines. But some Americanization is there as well. And so many of them, tens of thousands over there, were actually being trained as nurses. And I believe I put this in the module for this week in terms of a video. But many of them were being trained as nurses and actually brought over to the States because we were having a nurse shortage over the last few decades. And so even today, one of the biggest exporters that the Philippines has to America is in terms of medical care, nurses, practitioners, or anything similar. And so, next time you're at the hospital and you see, let's say, perhaps a Filipino worker there or a Filipino American worker, some of that kind of gets tied into some of the, culture there. But they're amongst one of the hardest workers that I've ever met. A few of my neighbors are Filipino, and I could definitely attest to that. Some good news. Just some random thing that I found that I wanted to share. World War II Filipino veteran gets congressional medal. So Mr. Almeida here initially did not get his medal when he was serving in World War II because he was Filipino, and once again, discrimination rears its ugly head. Over time, things have changed, and his services were recognized, and so especially in his old age, he was rightfully given his commendation. Korean Americans. Korean Americans have an interesting history as well. And I'm sorry if I cannot go as fully in detail to as many groups as I want to, but in one lecture it would be too much. Because you can go into an entire class into just one, let alone talk about it, every single person in one lecture. But Korean Americans, here we are. Korean Americans initially in the 1890s were migrating through Hawaii for sugarcane fields and work, over there. Eventually migrating to mainland, right? And so they become Korean Americans, and then migrating their work towards also railroads or commercial fairs, and different things such as this. Over the decades, businesses started to form, collaborations, communities, but then the big quintessential sort of moment happened in the 50s, the Korean War. And so the Korean War was a big sort of very big event for the Korean community because the United States got involved, China got involved, North and South Korea got torn apart, and continues to be apart today, right, because of the ideological differences. And so this caused a huge uptick in immigration immediately from South Korea. And so immediately after the Korean War, we started to see so many South Koreans actually migrate back towards the United States. And this is kind of encapsulated in the book, a bestseller book, Day and Night of Americans, as it said, from 1965. And so this was discussing the fuel and desire that many Koreans had to immigrate. And even having newspaper clippings telling similar stories, right, of folks that wanted to come to the United States for a better life that did not necessarily want to be part of that Korean Peninsula War, right, and that sort of stalemate standoff that they have even today. But all of this caused in the 70s and 80s and moving forward this huge boom in Korean immigration towards the States, this huge boom of Korean American communities, which, of course, traditional America rears its ugly head again. Nativist reactions and discrimination form and rise with the population boom. And so anti-Asian prejudice and discrimination was rising a bit by bit. However, Koreans did have some advantages coming in. The reason being, they usually came into major U.S. cities, which are kinder than, let's say, you moving into Kansas, which is very rural and conservative. And they were Christians. So they immediately came in with this very heavily Christianized mindset and religion. And so that helped for them to acculturate very easily. Even in my community here, probably, 30% or more, maybe even half the churches are Korean churches, but they're all Christian. So it's, the integration into society is that much easier, right? And then over time, as we're kind of seeing because especially in Los Angeles here, right, where we discussed Chinatown, but we also have Koreatown, right? So their own community in Koreatown was formed. Their own community was, building up their businesses, building up their communities, making sure their kids are going to school, and the kids are all, churning out with as many degrees as humanly possible. Eventually, and this is one of the quintessential sort of moments that we see during what is called the Yellow Power movement. And I think I have some videos after this. Yeah. What is called the Yellow Power movement. And so I have a few various videos kind of interspersed here. So feel free to visit the videos when you can. But the Yellow Power movement was this Asian American movement in the 90s, and is perfectly encapsulated in the sort of 92 LA riots, right? Because as the 1992 exploded in Los Angeles with these various riots, the Koreans in Koreatown, the Korean Americans, actually saw a lot of their businesses threatened, because this is 1992, right? This is not like the summer 2020 riots that we saw because of, in parts because of BLM, in part because of COVID and all of that things. But at least we have smartphones now and so many video cameras. But in 1992, you have like old, CCTV cameras, very kind of shady. People could easily just loot and break things and, move in. And so, a lot of the Korean Americans picked up their own rifles, their own automatic weapons, and started to protect their stores. And so, there's a couple videos here that I put in, right? Various gunfights in Koreatown. So the helicopters and the news helicopters are actually like, riding around, and they could see the Korean Americans actually getting into firefights with various people that are trying to come into their shops. And a couple of the interviews in those videos, the Korean store owner would be saying things like, I was getting a call from my brother or my cousin, and they're like, it's crazy down here. You got to come in, bring your guns. Like, they're looting the shop, and they're going to be trying to loot stuff. And so it was this interesting sort of tumultuous experience in 92. And so in this particular case, it's, seen that the Korean Americans are fully embracing their American patronage now, right? Their Second Amendment rights, especially. And so them kind of banding together and protecting their property, right? It was sort of seen as a perfect marriage between sort of the Korean heritage of having that close kinship, right, that we were talking about for some of the old school Eastern values, but also this perfect marriage with new Americanized ideals of protect your property, Second Amendment rights, get off my yard type of thing, right? So whether you want to say maybe this was a marriage between old world and new world, who knows? But the Yellow Power movement in general, what was it? After the Black Power movement was occurring with, let's say, the Black Panthers, right, in the Afro-American community, it caused many Asian Americans to question to themselves, like, what are we doing as a community, right? Do we have our own slogan? Do we have our own sort of civil rights issues that we have to, fight towards? And so this is a very long interview at the very bottom that I listed here, where they detailed the Yellow Power movement in its fullest extent, right? And kind of talk about what they exactly wanted to discuss. And it's a very interesting interview. But here are some photos from the 92 LA riots. Like I said, people literally looting the stores. There's chaos. What police, right? This is way back in the day, so it was much more difficult for police to kind of find everyone and not stop people from looting. But TVs were looted, stores were looted, right? I mean, all of Los Angeles, doesn't matter whether you're white, brown, black, or whatever, everyone was getting in on the action and looting. Things were being burned down. Things were getting pretty ridiculous and crazy. But this caused the Korean Americans. Look at them; they're just looking so badass with the cigarettes and everything. They are literally on their roofs of their businesses with guns pointing downwards, daring people. Not really daring, but essentially telling them like, "Hey, do not come near our stores." Right? We are going to protect our businesses here. We're not going to lose everything that we worked so hard for. Alrighty, entering into part 2 of our discussions here. So this is a more modern discussion I want to have in recent years about Asian representation in media. some effects of Asian culture and how media and perceptions are kind of formed. Maybe talking about some movies or video games or TV shows, and kind of Asian American stereotypes with the model minority myth, right? And so some more modern discussions here. But Asian American representation in film has been very interesting over the decades. The reason being is because initially, throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of the film was showing Asian Americans as sort of the, it's called the stereotypical Chinaman, right? Coming in with that sort of traditional Chinese or Japanese type of garb, not knowing English too well, or maybe just being a store clerk and, having that heavy broken English accent, whatever. That was kind of the perceptions that they were having. Over time, let's say we started having these, huge changing markers, right, in the film industry. Bruce Lee, in my memory, being like the biggest or one of the biggest sort of changes in that. Suddenly, right, from all the TV shows or movies, right, of like every Asian character being just like a store clerk owner, right, doesn't know English too well, etc., whatever, right, being like just uncool in general. And then now you see Bruce Lee, martial arts master, right, super cool, suave, all of his interviews on TV, he's just sharp-witted, right? He just boomed Asian Americans onto the big screen. And so this was also a combination of him utilizing that traditional sort of stereotype of Asians, being the sort of every single Asian is a kung fu master, quote unquote, stereotype, but him utilizing that in a very positive role, right? Creating his sort of Bruce Lee character on the big screen, to show that, these characters have strength, poise, wisdom, and, make for not only great television and entertainment, but also can give a good positive role model for Asian Americans watching these type of things. And then later throughout American cinema, whether we're talking about Indiana Jones or Rush Hour or any of these other type of movies, there was all of these positive reflections. This is a wonderful interview I found at the Chinese Theater in Los Angeles. And so the owner here is talking about how Asians have changed in the sort of film portrayal over time. And it's a very interesting video to watch if you're curious. And I of course, I had to put in the Enter the Dragon from 73. Some movie clips of Bruce Lee doing what he does best. Nunchucks, and just smashing people left and right. So if you've never really seen any of these movies and you're way too young and you're like, Enter the Dragon, what is this? It's a movie from the 70s. That's too old. I'm not going to watch that. Definitely give it a chance. They're pretty good. This is an interesting one. Indiana Jones, the second movie. And so the second movie here opens up. I believe they're in Shanghai, I believe, maybe Hong Kong, one of those cities. And so this beginning sort of 15-20 minute scene that they have essentially just has all of the plays of any type of like old school Asian stereotypes, right? So the entire club, that they're in is supposed to be owned by these sort of Asian gangsters, right? And everything that they see and hear, it's very kind of Asian Oriental inspired. And so after watching this video, this particular scene that I put in here, some questions for the class. How do you think Asians are portrayed in this movie? Whether we're talking about the mobsters, the young boy, Short Round, who is Indiana Jones' sidekick, or just anyone, let's say, throughout the streets, right, as they're doing their car chase throughout the actual city, right? How is Asian culture being portrayed here? Is it being portrayed in the same way and level as European and Americans, or is it being portrayed in another possible light? So this is a very kind of modernistic way for me to try to have a conversation about, right, portrayal here. Yeah, so anyone from Bruce Lee to Short Round over here, the portrayal of Asian Americans has definitely changed and evolved over time. But very interesting to see, and especially has been great foundational work for more modern examples. And we're going to talk about some of those modern examples coming up. Yeah, Short Round here definitely being a quintessential character in the Indiana Jones second film, helping Indy, being his sidekick, but not only sidekick, being like this grounding, heartfelt character, right? And so yeah, definitely kind of adding some nice weight to the film. I don't know if anyone has ever seen Rush Hour. For those of you who are in the more wiser years, such as myself, this is a '98 film. I love the Rush Hour series. Parts of it have aged nicely. Other parts have not aged as nicely, but I'm still going to use it as one of the examples, especially this particular scene. If you click it and you watch it, it's the famous scene where Chris Tucker just looks at Jackie Chan and says, "Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?" Right? And so it's a very interesting analysis with this derogatory broken English type of mindset, right? Or this sort of not mindset, but what's the term I'm looking for? Stereotype. Because many times in all of these types of films or TV shows, right, once again, right, that's old Hollywood stereotype of the Asian man comes in, doesn't really speak English too well, and then American audiences are just eating it up, right? And so Chris Tucker here is employing that very same sort of tactic of the broken English, right, of assuming that the person, just because they look, let's say, Asian, are automatically going to have some type of broken English. And so it is sometimes used in a derogatory term because obviously they are not native speakers. Hilariously enough, I didn't put the post clip of this scene, but the next scene is them driving around, and then suddenly Jackie Chan just busts out in perfect English, and he's like, "Oh, sorry, I was just teaching him how to get a gun from a suspect, right?" And then Chris Tucker's like, "What? You understood English the whole time?" He's like, "Well, you never asked me if I did. You just assumed that I didn't." And so it was this wonderful sort of play that Jackie Chan's character had on the situation, right? Where he bails Chris Tucker out of trouble and then teaches him a lesson saying, "Hey, you assumed that I didn't speak English. Don't assume." And so the messages were slowly being put into film, right, and kind of changing that dynamic for American audiences. Here is a wonderful interview I also found with Jackie Chan, because if we're talking about sort of film culture, I can't go out without saying anything about Jackie Chan, because this man is just like a legend when it comes to stunt work, kung fu movies, and just like Asian representation in the United States, because he's had so many big films, both in China, both in the U.S. And so here he actually talks about working with Chris Tucker and just, hilarious exchange on professionality, working in Hollywood as an Asian actor. And so also having, some conversations of the language barrier there too. And my sort of question or the poll for the class would be, have any of you had any misunderstandings or discrimination yourselves due to people thinking you cannot speak English properly, or even weirder, perhaps at certain times stating that, oh, you don't speak American or Americanized English or something, very similar. And this type of scenario or the broken English, quote unquote, stereotype can go towards anyone. If you, to the host country, if you start looking a little extra foreign, they might just assume at the grocery store or anywhere else that maybe you just don't speak English that well. And so, just being conscientious of some of these stereotypes and how people kind of view us, it's just interesting to kind of talk about in class. The Rush Hour series, great movies. There's 3 of them. I believe the 4th one just got announced as well. So definitely watch it if you have time. Yeah, there we go. I had a photo. So number 4 is announced. They're making number 4 as well. A great series, nice, lighthearted. They've held up decently over time. So I definitely think you should watch them if you're interested. Maybe for winter break, or maybe whenever, or a spring, summer break, whenever you have the time. Alrighty. Some more just conversation, because in recent years, and what I mean by recent years is maybe in the last like 10, 20 years or so, probably like 20. In Hollywood and through society of America, there's been this kind of general shift of, in Hollywood and in movies and in films, there has to be more representation in films, right? That's kind of been the huge rallying cry in the industry. So very recently, films like Black Panther, let's say, progressed African American representation largely with a majority black cast, director, proud demonstration of their heritage and clothing and culture, etc. Rest in peace, Chadwick Boseman. But very similarly, the Asian American community also had large strides in representation. I even remember in the 1990s, let's say, anime, right? And mangas and anime TV shows like Dragon Ball Z just started to really kind of blow up in the 90s for Americans and getting them introduced. Even today, half of your YouTubers or, whoever you're watching online, they might be manga fans, they might be anime fans. Half of you might watch some type of anime or have a brother or sister that's into that kind of stuff. It's really kind of just lifted off. I remember the early 2000s, let's say Avatar: The Last Airbender. A fantastic series. I highly recommend it. Professor Script gives it a 10 out of 10. Definitely go watch it. Heavily inspired Asian history, culture, fusion, right? Also bringing more Asian American or Asian culture to children and young adults watching this kind of things. And then if we're kind of moving up into kind of big league, large blockbuster level type of hits, Crazy Rich Asians was a huge monumental shift towards representation as well, having a mostly Asian American cast and changing this narrative that an all Asian cast cannot, let's say, make enough money in the United States, right, at the box office. And so they made $300+ million, right, off of the profits, only from a $30 million budget. So they're doing pretty well for themselves. And so this is also influencing Hollywood, right, to change their filmmaking tactics. Also, this does have a huge portion to do with the fact that China and that region of the world has also just started consuming much more, movies and TV shows in the recent years. They've become such a large market that even for Hollywood, whenever they're making a film nowadays, sometimes they will have the US version, and sometimes they will have, let's say, the China version, because they want to adjust a few things so that it will be more digestible for that audience as well. But yeah, major strides made in representation. Even the, of course, Chadwick Boseman, rest in peace, my man. But, even on the right-hand side here, right, we have the Hollywood Reporter. And on the very bottom, the risks and rewards of Crazy Rich Asians. Can the first studio movie of its kind in 25 years reshape the Hollywood landscape? The filmmakers turned down gigantic money at Netflix to prove it. The biggest stage with the biggest stakes, that's what we asked for. And so everyone here is very conscientious of the type of roles that Asian Americans would typically get in these movies. These type of opportunities did not come often, and this was their opportunity to really come out to the big stage strong, right, and prove everyone wrong. Here's a couple excellent videos that I've seen. If any of you are fans of Avatar: The Last Airbender, Mr. Dante Bosco, he voices Zuko with a beautiful sort of raspy voice that he has. And if you want to watch it from around the 11 to the 16-minute mark, he actually talks about his, I believe it's been like 20 years, 30 years or so, in the entertainment industry as an Asian American actor and voice actor, and how things have changed and how he has seen in the last couple of decades this narrative change, and his opportunities have also changed, right? So he's still relatively young. He's a working actor. And so it was very interesting for me to hear of him discussing in this type of TV show that I watched it when I was younger, his experiences and how his roles and perceptions have also changed of the industry. And then, of course, Crazy Rich Asians on the right-hand side, talking about a little bit more in depth with the author of the film and overall Asian American representation and how things have changed over time. And of course, Crazy Rich Asians, very successful in the U.S., very successful abroad, changing stereotypes, and of course, having an all Asian cast pretty much, and so definitely having greater strides towards representation. One thing I do want to talk about is called the model minority, and some of you, especially because we are in college, because I have to throw in the academic into here, right? I can't just talk about Hollywood and movies all day long. It's not a movie class. A recent case that they had at Harvard was the Harvard Affirmative Action case, Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard. Lasted for a few years, but eventually in 2019, it was finally resolved that Harvard was not discriminating based off of results or based off of ethnic identity. And so the lawsuit was essentially alleging that Harvard was discriminating against Asian students, right? Because the typical, I suppose, most of the people who were applying to Harvard of Asian descent or Asian American descent were getting crazy, ridiculous scores. 4.3 GPAs, perfect SAT scores, etc., etc. And so essentially what they were arguing was Asians represent 19% of the acceptance rate versus if they get their way and it's merit-based, they're going to be 43% of the hypothetical class coming into Harvard. And so Harvard finally ended up winning the admissions case and saying they were not discriminating. But this kind of goes into this other question, right? The model minority. What the heck is that? And let's have a conversation about it. The model minority, whether myth or otherwise, is the various demographic that are perceived to have a higher degree of some type of socioeconomic success and are sort of the perfect role models. So for instance, the general stereotype is Asians are the perfect minority. They're smart, they get straight A's, they play 5 different instruments and speak 7 different languages by the time they're 12, and they're perfect. They're going to get into any type of college they want, and they're all going to be doctors, right, and lawyers. These stereotypes have also been imprinted, let's say, with the famous Family Guy scene. The father walks in and his young son, he's like, I don't know, 9th, 10th grade, just like studying. The father walks in and, sort of just very loudly says, "Are you doctor yet?" He's like, "No, Dad. I'm like 15. He's like, "Don't talk to me until you doctor." And then he just, slams the door. So these type of things, keep reverberating throughout society. But the model minority, whether it's a myth or otherwise, let's have a conversation about it. So here on the bottom, I put 2 arguments, and these are the 2 arguments currently present in academic circles / just society in general. The first one would be, if you look at it from a cultural / perhaps just realistic perspective, right? If you look at all the demographics, you look at the numbers, you look at the prison incarceration rates, you look at the socioeconomic status of every single demographic in the United States, Asian Americans are doing very well, generally speaking. Hardworking, exceptionalism, old school family values, putting their kids through school, right? Many of them are kind of going into STEM fields. And so in a certain, light, they would be considered a great model minority, right? Or whatever, that type of, phrase might denote. However, on the other end of the spectrum, the other argument is that by holding Asian Americans to such a high standard, it's unfair bias, thereby burdening younger generations. Because imagine to yourself, let's say if you are someone of Asian American descent, and you are a great artist, right? You are an amazing artist, sculptor, painter, music maker, whatever. You suck at math. Pretty much, right, the Asian model minority myth would say, well, you're Asian, you have to be great at math, you have to get straight A's and that stuff, but let's say you're just horrendous and you're just art focused, right? You can be the most amazing painter ever. You're not going to do great on any of your algebra courses. And so this kind of burdens younger generations with this sort of expectation and discrimination, right? That they're going to be the best students, get straight A's, etc. And that any person of Asian American descent that's actually, let's say, like, for instance, a mediocre student or just kind of figuring life out and deciding what major to choose, etc., it's even tougher for them. And so I can definitely attest to some of this myself, because I suppose to a certain extent I can call myself Asian American because I was born in Uzbekistan, which is Central Asia, and I do have some Asian blood in me. So to what extent am I actually Asian, I don't know. I'm a very weird mix when it comes to blood genetics. But there you go. But I still came from the eastern part of the world, the Soviet Union, Central Asia sort of culture. And a lot of these things that are in the first argument, hard work, education, exceptionalism, family values, orienting children for very realistic, high-paying type of jobs, that's all very true in these type of cultures, right? And it works, right? But to a certain extent, it's also very kind of burdening for the generations, because even me growing up, it's like it is expected of you to get A's. It is expected of you to be someone. It is expected of you to get into good college and to do X, Y, and Z. So to what extent is that actually burdening, and to what extent is that actually pushing people towards success? The debate continues. So you choose for yourselves what side of the aisle you'd rather be on. Oh.
A lawsuit.
It's not what I wanted. Boom. Let's see. That's what happens when you mess with your OBS settings, folks. Real-time changes.
A loss.
This is a wonderful TED Talk that I found. So this is from Alice Lee, saying why Asian Americans are not the model minority. And here she goes through various reasons why, let's say, she's not or her friends are not. And so she's a great example to talk about, let's say, why she does not like the Asian minority myth. Because, let's say, she was not the stellar 5.0 student, and it just, it's an extra level of burden. And she wants to actually explore other things in life, and also not to be identified as, oh, hey, your friend's Asian? Oh, she must be super wicked smart, right? That kind of just generalized stereotype. Obviously, it's a good stereotype to have, right? For you to be stereotyped, I suppose, if you had to choose for success, right? But, stereotypes are stereotypes nonetheless. Oh, and last but not least, I don't know if anyone has seen this movie on Netflix, Always Be My Maybe. This is a very funny comedy, a great sort of recent, in the last few years, an Asian American film that came out with a majority Asian American cast, and Keanu Reeves makes a wonderful little cameo. And so in this particular scene, the sort of protagonist, right, he's trying to fall in love with his childhood sweetheart, this lady right here. I believe she's a professional comedian, right, in real life, an actress. So he's trying to fall in love with her, his high school sort of sweetheart. But then Keanu Reeves comes in very kind of like cool, suave Keanu Reeves way. But in this movie, he plays like the douchiest version of what Keanu Reeves potentially might be, right? And so, it's just a very interesting kind of perspective on it. And with that, we have ended chapter 14. Not without hiccups, obviously. I showed everyone my desktop for about 20 seconds, but that's fine. Anyways, here's the end of chapter 14. I want to thank every single one of you for being here, listening to the lecture. And if you found it helpful, definitely stick around for the next one. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Take care.